Greetings. So I've been watching YouTube, of course, reading Reddit and so on. There have been a couple videos and a couple articles, and this has been a topic for the past whatever 20 years at the very least of discussing tabletop RPGs, which is why don't we play more rules like games, or don't the mechanics just get in the way? Why do we need mechanics in the first place? We're just playing make believe. And a lot of those discussions, I think, stem from sort of folks that start the hobby in games that are relatively rules heavy, D&D, Pathfinder, sort of legacy games, as it were, or mainstream games, and aren't getting what they expect out of the games, or shift to like a more rules like game, like a Powered by the Apocalypse or Fate, and have sort of a revelation. Oh my God, I was doing it wrong. These rules like games make a lot of sense, and they hit on what I find important in gaming, and you're doing it wrong too. Like, so they want to wake up the masses, right? They have discovered Amway, and they want you to buy, to buy this roll of toilet paper for $82, or so would you like some Mary Kay cosmetics, kind of thing. And I've always played fairly rules heavy games, starting with, of course, advanced D&D way back when, and into hero system, and then writing games for my table, and they're all rules heavy too. And my rules light game, I always joke that my rules light game nowadays, if I just want to do a rules light game where I don't care about the rules, we play hero system, which is considered reasonably heavy by most folks, but it really isn't. But that's a different discussion. But if you ask me what my rules light game is, I go hero. I will run 5th edition hero if I need a rules light experience where the rules don't matter. So why do I why do I stick with rules heavy games? And I obviously there's a preference aspect, which I'm actually going to touch on, but there is sort of a more general defense for, I think, rules heavy games. And don't get me wrong, the vast majority of role players play a rules heavy game. 5th edition is actually fairly rulesy in the spectrum of tabletop RPGs today. So to some degree, I don't think rules heavy games need defending, but they're defended by the almighty dollar, right? The free market has spoken. Rules heavy games win. Rules light games, take a second place. But it's interesting to talk about, right? Because I often do think about, I often joke that I want to love a rules light game enough to play it and make that my forever game. Never happened. Probably never will. I just can't quite get there. Because I do occasionally have the same revelation that, man, if we could just get these rules out of the way, we could really get to the important things. But it never happens because I think rules heavy games, again, certainly have a place at my table. And why is that? So that's sort of what we're discussing. And why so rules heavy? Why, man? Why can't you get? I can't. And I did. Obviously, this is unscripted, unprofessional. I have to figure out what to call this segment. The rambling GM, maybe, because I will tend to ramble. But I did have. I went to ChatGPT and said, "Here, write me a script based on like these bullet points," and it did, and it did decent. ChatGPT is mostly the democratization of mediocrity, I do feel, but it did decent, which might tell me you shouldn't make this video because there's no point. But I'm not going to use the script. I'm just going to go off my note card here and ramble a bit. So if I do, forgive me. Certainly, this is unprofessional. We are just bullshitting about games here. So I think so. Why rules heavy? And in this case, this isn't preference as more of an explanation. But the first reason is simply legacy. I mean, these games were born of a desire to. I mean, you can go back to primal days here and go, hey, yeah, they're all just make believe cops and robbers, cowboys, and Indians kind of play, and they're just let's pretend, and thus we don't need rules. But the modern tabletop RPG stems back from the chainmail days, right? The guy, everybody's heard of Gygax and Arneson and his gaming group wanting to bring more personal stakes to medieval war game simulations, right? So we've come from war games, and I think that's in the DNA in a lot of cases. You can see it straight, right, winding through. So it makes sense that there's a whole bucket of games that carry that legacy forward. Is it a good reason to? No, it's not a good reason to play a heavy game. To go, well, I just want to do what these guys did 40 years ago. 40 years? 50 years ago? I mean, do you care? And the answer is no, you shouldn't. You should play the game you want to play, of course. But I think it's a decent explanation if you wanted to know why we're here. Because we started here. we're here because that's what the games always have been. And and I don't know that they would have, and the funny part is, so you were effectively seeing Darwinism at work a little bit, I think, in that kids were always playing let's pretend make believe, but none of that was commercially viable. There's no way D&D exists today if it was a rules light game. There are simulations, like they have done sort of, right, diplomatic and wargamey sims that are just a referee and they're rules light, and that the referee adjudicates all of the moves, etc. But and those existed before D&D, the earliest incarnations of D&D. But those weren't commercially viable. I think it took a game with rules, a book of rules. Now, not a lot of rules. D&D, basic D&D, Blue Book D&D was not and before that, the three white books, we'll call them, the beige books, the white, they're not super heavy. They're not, but not, at least not compared to today. Not compared to Champions 5th edition, which I have somewhere on my shelf. Look for whatever is gravity. It's up there, actually. You can see it right there. Look for whatever gravity is pulling all the other books into it. I don't consider early editions of D&D to be super rules heavy, but they were rulesy, in the sense that, you were playing by a set of rules. It wasn't make believe. It was, it wasn't, hey, let's pretend. It was, no, you're doing this. You're playing by these rules. There is a pretend aspect to it in the sense that these rules only cover so much of what you can do, and then the GM has to adjudicate everything else. But when the crap hit the fan and you were fighting, you're playing by these rules, and you can, and I think that's what it took to actually get us to this point. I think if you powered by the apocalypse in 1975 or something, you don't get here. It never becomes as popular. And so I think what you're seeing is a natural evolution of, certain lines of games and the ones that sort of and it only makes sense, I think. Again, this is just opinion. It only makes sense that the games then got heavier, if that makes sense. Um, you know, from D&D, and we go, wow, this is really cool. I love this. You're not going to take stuff away. You're going to go, man, I wish I had 8 more classes and 100 more spells. And, I really wish a two-handed sword and a dagger had something to differentiate them meaningfully other than just a little bit of damage. And what happens if I attack you from behind? And, right, I mean, I think it's only natural that you got from basic D&D to advanced D&D to games like GURPS and Hero. I think it's all very natural progression from, I love this thing, wouldn't it be cool if I did this other thing with that? And wouldn't that be cool? And so on and so forth. And some of that natural evolution then makes games heavier. And again, you could see that into the 80s with games like Aftermath and Space Opera, and I'm naming a lot of FGU games, and Hero System. And I think also you could see then where some folks would go, I sort of love this, but man, I don't love slogging through an hour of combat. What if we cut this down? Or, I want to tell a different type of story. What if we cut this, change the paradigm? And so that's where you see this Rules Light set of games then also come to fruition. I think you're just seeing a very natural evolution of people going, wow, I love this thing. Let's do this. Let's change it. Because that's also been part of the legacy of the hobby, part of the legacy of tabletop games. Which is one of the reasons I say that I love the OSR, even though I don't love the games, is I love the homebrew aspect of them. I love the idea that they're taking something they love, which is often basic D&D or old versions of D&D, and then making one twist or two twists or some very clever, and bam, and now we have a new OSR game. That's natural. That's what this hobby was about and is still about, I feel. So I think legacy has a big part in it. Not that should compel you to do it, but I think what you're seeing, the current state of, hey, we got some light games and a lot of heavy games, and why do people seem to like this one and don't like these ones as much? Why are heavy games more popular? I think a lot of that comes down to simply the legacy of D&D, where it started and how it evolved over time. The next one is, I didn't say, so you gotta, my graphics are really cheesy. Next one is just preference, gamer preference. So, I play with a lot of different folks. I play with an old school wargamer guy, his wife, who never played a war game in her life. Does play, board games, but we're talking Catan and Roll for the Galaxy, games like that. Not, not Pacific War or Enemy at the Gates, right? That's not her game. I play with a guy who wouldn't touch a war game in his life, but loves Magic Realm. But, and I play with, again, another, sort of war gamer. I play with a bunch of, I play with my kids, and I play with Jeff's kids. And again, a lot of these kids have never played a war game. My kids have never played a Hex Encounter war game. Eclipse, Magic Realm is probably the height of complexity that most of my kids have ever touched. But again, that's not even a Hex Encounter war game, right? So we have my point. Let's get to the damn point. My point is, we have a lot of different folks, but I think the driving preference, and by driving preference, I mean there's always, I think in any group, we have 8 people at the table, 9 if you count me. I think there's always one or two or three people that drive any given table. Like those are the preferences that move the game, and other folks tend to follow along. You very rarely do you get a proper like a true uh, um, quorum or certainly not a unanimous verdict on different things and different mechanics and so on. People like different things about games and tables. People dislike different things about games and tables. But I think you always have in most social groups and in most gaming tables for sure one or two or three preferences. A lot of times that's a GM, but just often as not, there's a couple players that also dictate that. And I think our preference at our table. So let's change this from gamer preference to table preference. Oops, that was the wrong place to type shit. Um, and I think our preference, if you ask Scott, if you ask me for sure, I think maybe Jeff, is that I like the idea of having a man-to-man tabletop war game. Fantasy table, right? I want a man-to-man war game. I want to play firepower or ambush and have it meaning have a campaign that lasts for however long, right? I want those. I want an Uber Legacy board game. Like I want to play Gloomhaven, but not with card rules. I want I want a tactical man-to-man fantasy war game, but I want a story around it, and I want the story to weave through those fight scenarios. I want the fight scenarios to have a reason. I want them to have a meaning. I want the ramifications to have a meaning. I want the downtime, the in-between time to have a meaning, and I want it all to tie together. So the fact that every so often we break into 1+ hour war games in the middle of our tabletop role-playing session is a feature and not a bug, I suppose, is what I'm trying to get at. I think a lot of folks on the other side, right, once they have that revelation, they become story game guys or they become rules light guys, they think that they see that long, complicated combat to be a bug. That's a problem to be solved. Why are you doing that? You can't be having fun. And the answer is no. That's the point. I want a miniatures war game inside my tabletop role-playing game. And I don't necessarily have any preference for which is more important. I think that shifts over time. I think that shifts different nights, and I think that shifts during the night. But I want that in there. I want that. I want to role play. I want to hang out. I want to tell a story. I want to, whatever, hang out at the bar or have my guys tromping through the swamp as they head to Mount Doom. I want all that. I want Samwise to cast loving glances over at Frodo. But I also want a flanking bonus. I want to know that this type of armor and this type of weapon, how they go against one another. Like, oh, you should not be using a slashing weapon. That dude has plate armor on. That ain't gonna work. Or chainmail. Maybe you should thrust and stab him and pierce through that. Those are the kind of things I want to see. I love that. I want all those other things, but I want the fact that I am standing next to an ally with a shield and he has to matter. I want that to matter. And so I think so long story short, it's a feature, not a bug. If you tell me, wow, I can't believe that you guys had a night where literally it was the set piece boss battle and it took 4 hours, that sounds horrible. Or does it sound wonderful? and for me, for us, I think, and for the table, I think And we've had those nights. And I love it, right? And the table loves it, and we love it. That is the preference. It's funny because so I've written also a superhero game, and I bristle a tiny bit, and don't care. I'm long past caring. I have no interest in arguing over at the internet. But I do like making these videos, and I do like talking to folks, and I do like comments. So there you go. There's your like, subscribe, comment, a call to action. Right where the YouTube wanted to put it. No, just kidding. Oh, not the YouTube. I'm sorry. Right where ChatGPT wanted to put it. I screwed that joke up. But I have a superhero game, and surprise, it is a tactical miniatures superhero combat game, and then there's RPG mechanics lightly wrapped around it. And I bristle a tiny bit when people go, well, I mean, you should play Masks because superhero games aren't about fighting. They're like soap operas, and they're about all the interpersonal stuff. And I go, hold on. No. I mean, yes, they can be about all that stuff, but they can also be about the fighting. There's a reason why people obsess over who would win between whatever Batman and Aquaman. I mean, theoretically, Batman wins every fight because they've written him as some kind of god genius. But having said that, there's a reason why when two heroes meet, in a lot of times in the comic books, the first time they meet, one of them has to misrecognize or miss as a villain, and they have to fight for a while because we're obsessed, comic book fans, we're obsessed with how character X stacks up against character Y. Why isn't combat an important part of a superhero tabletop role-playing game, right? So I think a lot of that has to do with preference, and our table's preference is, I want a 4-hour freaking combat every so often. Karen, who plays our game, she gets antsy if we're not fighting. If we have a whole night where we're not fighting, she's like, why did I show up? What are you doing? What are you doing to me? Are you trying to put me to sleep? Come on, let's get to it. And so I do think that there is a place for, hey, I want to bust some heads, and rules-heavy games are great for busting heads. The third one is a shared rules. And this is one where people go, well, if you have a bad GM, like if you had a good GM, you wouldn't worry about that because you wouldn't need to have these mechanics out there. And the answer is, well, sure. I mean, look, there is a level of trust that I think you have with your GM to assume that he's going to adjudicate the world correctly and so on. Having said that, it's very hard. Even the best, most fair, most cinematically minded GM is going to have trouble if you continuously ask them to have to come up with the exact set of consequences or the exact adjudication, right? He's not real. We're not really simulating that in your head. He's making arbitrary decisions, right? Your GM probably doesn't know anything about stealth or martial art. I mean, he might. I'm not saying he doesn't, but I'm saying most, just on statistically, if I pick a topic, your GM doesn't know shit about it. Let's understand that. So he's making arbitrary decisions based on limited experience, and he's trying his best. And that's what they're doing, right? And so it's one of those things where you go, well, I mean, if we just go with this arbitrary stream of consciousness decision-making process, then the decisions at some point will be inconsistent, or they will be unfair, they will maybe not make sense at times, and so on and so forth. If you have a game in the middle of you, an honest-to-goodness set of rules, and someone asks me, well, what's my chance to pick that dude's pocket? I'm no longer making an arbitrary decision. We both know what the chance is to pick his pocket. Oh, you're a 4th level thief, so it's 28%, or whatever that the damn table is in advanced D&D. Or in Runebearer, my game, it's like, well, the DL is 10. What's your skill? Oh, my skill is 10 also. Well, you have about a 54% chance of succeeding. Um, would you like to, right? Would you like to try, or would you like to try to convince me of a modifier? Right? Let's get a modifier. Is there any way that we can distract him, or right? That whole thing. There's a shared rules. How much damage will I take if I jump from this 30-foot ledge onto concrete? Good, maybe good to know that, right? And the answer is, well, if you have a set of rules, then you at least have a basis for understanding what your chance of success is, what possible consequences of failure are, even if there isn't a specific rule for the thing you're asking, there might be a framework there that the GM can utilize to then make the decision. Hero system is great for this. You don't need a rule for everything. Hero pretty much has you covered. You can go, well, I think what's going to happen is when you shoot that tank of volatile gas, it will explode for 8d6 explosion damage. And now you know exactly what that's going to do to the thugs standing around it. Not exactly, because it's dice you're rolling, but you know what I mean. You have a good idea. So I do think that there is value in having a shared framework of what's my chance of success, what are my consequences for failure, and we both know that. And you're not just making it up, and you're not being asked to continuously be a physics engine and a social arbiter and a right that whole thing. And there's a place for that, and obviously even as you get, I mean, that's one of the things, by the way, that OSR folks often talk about. They go, well, you have all these games and everything's defined, so if you write a rule for it, then that rule also excludes other people from trying to do the thing. If you have a talent which is +1 to put a bucket on someone's head, I don't know where that came from, but that implies that everybody else doesn't have that +1. Or if you have a talent which allows you to trip someone, it implies that no one else can trip anyone. And I agree with that. I think that's one of the difficulties with games like Pathfinder First Edition, and third D&D 3, with the feat-based builds. I do think that you have the issue of well, in old D&D, I would try to trip someone, and the GM would just figure that out and make that up. And old school games, lighten up that, right? They're way more rules like than a lot of these later games like Advanced D&D, Hero, etc. And the idea in doing that is to allow you to do more things. And the GM wings it. And that's okay. Ruling's not rules. And I'm good with that too. But I think that a shared framework, regardless of how heavy that framework might be, is very useful. So maybe that third one doesn't really say, hey, you should be rules heavy. I prefer, as my preference, I'm going to prefer rules heavy. I'm going to prefer to know, hey, you're flanking unless you get a thing, as opposed to someone asking me, well, what does it mean if I'm flanking? Because there's no rule for it. And then me going +1, right? Or whatever. I prefer having that laid down for me and giving me then, and then later if something hits where I don't have a rule, I can go, well, a lot of these modifiers are +2. Why don't I just give you a +2 for that also? Right, and D&D 5th actually does this quite well. I mean, I don't love advantage and disadvantage as a mechanic, but it is a effective mechanic because the GM can just go, well, it sounds like you have advantage, or it sounds like you're going to have disadvantage. And that's the framework. Done. They win. It's not super heavy, but it does give you, why do we have mechanics? Well, you got a shared set of rules. Another one, which I might be reaching for, I think that a shared this. I think these allow you to drill down on what's important, in the sense that, if you look at, so this is the my take on system matters, kind of, right. It is saying that whatever rules you pick, you're going to drill down on things that are important. D&D 5th obviously thinks character builds are important and combat is important. And spells and spell effects are important, and having those defined is very important. Uh, Third edition D&D is character builds are very important. Position is important. It's telling you what's important, right? The rules drill down on things that are important. And a lot of games, a lot of rules heavy games, obviously feel combat is very important. They drill down heavy on combat. Again, I don't know whether that's, I think this is important, or whether it's just legacy a little bit, that every game seems to drill down on combat, so I'm going to write my game and drill down on combat too. Um, but if you look at, say, as a for instance, early versions of D&D, and if you, for instance, look at, say, some OSR games, they shift that emphasis from combat. A lot of them do, and combat becomes simpler again. Oh yeah, we just roll initiative per side, and then you do a d20 and blah blah blah, and you hit or not hit. There's not that much position. We don't have all these bonuses flanking. We cut those rules down, and then we focus on the mechanics, the specific mechanics of exploration, and we start telling the GM very specifically, hey, every hour you mark a torch off. Every 20 minutes you might roll a monster check, a wandering monster check. There might be mechanics for resting and rations and resting safely and so on. And so, I like rules heavy games because rules heavy games can start to detail what is important to them and really get into it. So again, Runebearer, combat is a thing, and casting magic spells is a thing, and we have, and there are lots of rules for all of that. But as we play like a hex crawl or whatever, I pull out the rules for traveling, the rules for camping safely, and we detail down, and we start having a little bit of a logistics discussion of, well, how many days of food is it going to be? It's only a 3-day trip if your navigator gets you there in 3 days. And if your pathfinder can avoid hazards, and your scouts can detect any incoming enemies ahead of time. And we drill down into that level because that becomes then important. And I like having that whole planning the trip to get from A to Z. And so I made that important in the game. And another thing which I find sort of interesting, but again, a lot of games don't do this, because all combat is, if you think about it, in D&D, combat is what I call a mini game. The actual base game is you roll a d20, add some stuff, and do you hit a DL? That's the base mechanic. All the other stuff in combat is actually a variation of that mechanic. It is a mini game. It is a set of rules tacked onto that mechanic. And a lot of games, so for instance, D&D, original D&D was actually full of mini games, advanced D&D. You had, and barely had a base mechanic, by the way, but that's a different discussion, which is sort of fun. But if you look at base, like early versions of D&D, it's interesting because it's all mini games, really. Thieves had their own mini game. It's a percentage table, so it's a dull mini game. Combat was a mini game. Spellcasting didn't really interface, like you don't roll to spellcast. It wasn't part of a skill system or whatever. But you had this other set of rules then to follow. I had to memorize spells and write down my lists and so on. Psionics. Not that anyone that used psionics in AD&D, God bless you, but psionics minigame. You had a whole extra game for fighting psionically. Same thing with hand-to-hand combat, wrestling, and unarmed combat. You had a mini game for that, and each of those. Now, to be honest with you, most people just ignored most of those rules. A lot of them were imbalanced and or nonsensical and didn't necessarily make for good play. They're not particularly good rules. Having said that, they drilled down into things that I believe the authors thought were important to drill down on. Oh, you know what? Presumably at some point someone said, I want to be a wrestler. And someone wrote, you know what? We're going to write some wrestling rules. Let's do it. Because that's important. And I bet you they had a good time with those in the moment. Now, I wouldn't, again, use them because, again, they all sort of make no sense really in the context of the game of advanced D&D. But at some point, I think they felt they were important. I bet you they used them in some ways to to do a thing. And again, someone enjoyed them. And probably one guy made a giant strength 1800 big bear wrestler guy and kicked a lot of ass. But yeah, so for something like Runebearer, I like magic, so there's rules for let's make your own spell. How do those spells propagate to other mages? What are the casting times for it's all this thing. How do you get your levels back? There's how do you get another rune? That kind of thing. So it's all in there because I feel that's important. Traveling, I feel is important, so we have rules for it and so on. So they allow me to drill down and highlight and focus, and then give the player something to interact with parts of the game I like. Done. And this one's going to ruin. I'm going to shorten that. This is probably the most important one. So it's down in number 5 because I'm a good writer. Rules-heavy games allow you to tell different types of stories. I think that a lot of folks that go to the rules light, right? That they pound the rules light drum. And this is their preference. They get their own preference. They can play their game, and that's cool. But I think we focus on telling a certain type of story. I think a lot of videos and a lot of the gestalt of D&D community is we should be telling stories like novels or movies. That's a certain type of story, the narrative story, the cinematic story, we'll call it. Because I think we are conditioned to want to tell that type of story because we go and watch them. Everybody's, I watched the Fallout show. I want to tell a story like that. Or I watched, I don't know, I can't think of a good movie. I watched Lord of the Rings. I wish I could tell that story. Well, that's a weird, I don't know. Damn, what movie have I watched recently? That's the problem. I haven't watched any movies recently. But you get the idea. I'm sorry. I flubbed that one too. I would edit it if I cared enough, but I'm not going to. I want to tell a story like the original Alien movie. Okay, right? I want to tell a story like Terminator. I want to tell it. We are conditioned to want to tell stories like that because we have been told that is the pinnacle of storytelling, kind of, right? That we should be emulating. I think video games have this problem too, in the sense that I think that folks in the video game industry for a long time, their stories were compared to movie stories. They were found wanting. And so the move has been to move closer and seg closer and closer to movie stories. And a lot of the tech and a lot of the effort has been, how can we make something worthy of a movie? And that's fun. That is a type of story which is fun to tell. It's awesome to tell those. Our games should be able to tell those types of stories when we want them to. But I also want to tell a different type of story. I want to tell the story of the party trying to get home after a nasty encounter with a nasty monster and being injured and impaired and whatever, infected, and they have to try to get back, and they're running out of food, and the navigator is, incapacitated, and thus they have to, you know, pick someone who's not suited for that, and maybe they get lost, and maybe you see where I'm going. I want to also not only do I want to tell the planned cinematic story where I have an outline and I walk you through and you do the things and you make one or two choices, but it's, right, the story that I've guided you through, the cinematic narrative story. I also want to be able to tell an emergent story, a story that just happens because the way the rules worked out. Now, it's a terrible cinematic story because what I really wanted you to do was get to the flame shrine and beat the flame priest, but you didn't get there because in the meantime, I rolled a wandering encounter with 2 trolls, and the trolls jumped the party and first round shattered the leg of the guy who's going to do who's the navigator when they travel, and gravely damaged the healer, and so on. And they finally got taken down in a rough battle, only a day away from where the flame shrine is. And then they decide, God, we have to turn around. There is no way we even, the healer is out cold and not coming back soon. We need to turn back around. Fortunately, it's only 4 days to town. Let's make this happen. But our navigator's unconscious, and so on and so forth. It's a terrible cinematic story. You almost never would see that story in a novel or a book because the goal of the novelist was to get them to the flame shrine so they could have the confrontation with the flame priest. The game, the simulation, the emergent story was, nope, they got jumped by 2 trolls, got their asses whooped. Now they have to turn around and struggle their way back through rough terrain without a navigator and hope that they can get back. Hope that they can salvage some, have a clever idea, salvage something. Oh, I have a potion. Oh, I can heal the healer, or I can heal the navigator, or, right, they have something up their sleeve, or they get lucky, or they get unlucky, and then what happens? I used to tell people, when I used to discuss crap on internet forums, I said, yeah, you guys all want Star Wars. I want a good baseball game. Sometimes. And what I mean by that is, a lot of baseball doesn't make for a good story. It's not all the natural where where he hits the thing and it hits the lights and they all explode and everybody cheers, and if you build it, they're not guaranteed to come. Right? Sometimes you build it and no one comes. Sometimes you strike out. Sometimes the game's boring because it's a 10-1 blowout. But occasionally, every so often, it's the bottom of the 9th with 2 on, 2 out, and it is so special when that happens. And I feel that role-playing games also have the ability to tell that type of story. There's not just one type of story we want to tell. There's another type of story, and that is this weird emergent story that happens because of some confluence of the rules and the dice and the players and so on. And you can have emergent stories from role-playing. You can have, right, the players are there, they're doing unexpected things, and the GM riffs off them, and they riff off the GM. It's you can do the improvisational theater thing back and forth where, we don't know what's going to happen. And that's fine, too. I've had some interesting emergent stories come about via that also. And now I often tell a story, and this video is running long, I feel bad. I often tell a story where we had a group, and they were in effectively, a Bostonia. We weren't playing Rune Bear at the time. We were playing effectively Hero system, Bostonia. And they went in, and I had sort of riffed the dungeon in my head off of like a funeral home kind of gig. And so they were going through, and it was a several rooms, and there was a dungeon, and in one place they had found a bunch of like embalming fluids and preservatives and so on, things to preserve the flesh and remove the rot of flesh and so on. And they had alchemists, so they knew what this stuff was after having spent some time to study it. And then several rooms away, blocking their way to get through to the next thing that they wanted to do, was the rotting zombie king and his zombie sword, right? And I described him on a whim, and he was there, and and as he talks, his ear falls off, and the whole thing. And one of the players is like, "Whoa, we don't have to fight. How about?" And the zombie king, for whatever reason, and they knew this, couldn't leave because I think the area was warded. Like, right, some priest had put wards around the whole thing, and so he was trapped here. And the party had to go through his area to get through to the next area. And one of the players said, right, and they were doing the back and forth, and they were going to fight. Absolutely, 100%. There's like 20 zombies, 6 of them, the zombie king. It was going to be ugly. And the guy says, wait, king, we humbly request to pass through, and we can give you an offering. And they offered to, of course, go back quite a bit, and then drag in all of these embalming, preserving, flesh-preserving concoctions back to the zombie king. I see you have a problem with your ear, sir. Great story. Emerging. That is emergent story. I believe that is emergent storytelling also. Having said that, you can get a lot of mileage out of the dice if you let the dice help you out and tell the story a bit. And that is why rules heavy. And yes, you can get that with light games. Oh, you rolled a yes, but. Oh, great, you have a complication. No, that's fine. But what I really love is when you have lots of intertwining, complicated systems that touch each other, and something that happens over here then causes an effect over here that the players now must deal with. Oh, yeah, your starship got hit, and based on that damage, oh my god, the engine blew up, and now the engine's the engine room's on fire with a plasma fire. What are you going to do? Now, that could have been just a yes, but, oh, you succeeded or failed with a complication, and the GM thinks, oh, your engine room's on fire now, and that's great. But man, it feels a lot better when you roll through all those dice, and all of a sudden you realize you're 3 days from home, you're out of food, you got no navigator, your healer's dying of an infection. What are you going to do? And it's all the dice that made this happen. And that is a cool type of story. It is an exciting type of story. It is a valid type of story for our games. And I think heavy games, simulationist games, are very much a good vehicle to produce those stories, and better than a rules light game typically. So we're going to move on because, again, I'm taking way too much of your time for this this drivel. Another reason I really like it, frankly, and we'll be short on these two, I think. I'll be longer on this one than the other one, I promise. It allows me to shift gears. So, it's so neat. One of the neat things about RPGs, tabletop RPGs especially, is that there are so many different modes of play. We can be just inter-party. The party can be role-playing with itself. Like, I could just be sitting there going, oh, good. These guys are talking in character back and forth about, current events or the latest situation or what they're going to do about, or they're not, or they're just talking about the meal they just had, right? In character. That's one mode of play. Another mode of play, obviously, is the back and forth between NPCs and PCs. Excuse me. Trying to get something done, right? Trying to convince these NPCs. We have a lot of that in our current game because the current game has 7 different groups that have to be able to vote on anything the town does. And so every time something important comes up, you got to at least find out what, and one of the players runs one of the groups. So you have to find out what the other 6 groups are going to vote and figure out what they need to get their vote to you, to your way. And that's another mode of play. And another mode of play is exploration. We're exploring the dungeon, or we're exploring the wilderness. And another mode of play could be, and we'll go dungeon exploration, and we'll go wilderness travel. That could be a mode of play. And it's different, right? There's different rules to each of them, actually, in most games. In this game particularly, and in a game where there's not a lot of subsystems, and those subsystems are exactly the same, or the game's very rules light, and the GM is just being asked to arbitrate. Oh, you're going to travel. Well, okay. Which one of you has the pathfinding skill set? Well, I do. Okay, I get a +1. Roll 2 dice. Oh, I rolled an 8. That's a 9 because you're +1, and you get there, but you have a complication. Okay, right? And that's fine. I'm not actually dissing anyone's mode of play. I don't care how anyone else plays. But what I like is that when we go from, oh, we're role playing, to, well, we got to make a trip now. Now that's a logistics game, and that shifts gears. We have a subsystem. They're going to have to buy stuff. They're going to have to, and I go, the DL of the terrain between you and there is going to be 14. Oh, our navigator's only 10. Man, we better pack some extra days, right? Or whatever. Or get ourselves a way to get a modifier to that, to give a plus to the navigator. We're shifting gears. You could be dungeon exploration, and you're creeping through, and you have the trapper in front, and he's checking and rolling for traps and rolling his search to make sure, and you've got the people in the back, and I go, okay, roll your search to see if you hear anything, right? And then they're exploring, they're doing all this stuff, and then you say roll for initiative, right? And the game shifts, and you're immediately shifting into this other mode. And that's cool, actually. That's exciting. That can build some tension. That can relieve tension. Right? We just had this really cool moment between 2 characters, and now ninjas have showed up, rolled for initiative, right? Or whatever. Or the game is slowing down, and I'm like, you know what? We're going to throw something at them. Or they've just fought for 3 hours. You know what we're going to do? We're going to back off and do something else for a couple hours. And having those rule sets, complicated rule sets, allows me to shift gears, because each mode of play is different enough that it feels different, and it engages different folks, and it engages different parts of the brains, and it engages, right? Combat is combat, and it's very complicated. And dungeon exploration has different folks which have to then engage their skills, different skills, and so on. And yeah, if it all is the same rules, or it's oh, you roll once and you add a number and done, then it's not as exciting. But I do think that having that, when you're exploring or when you're role playing or whatever, you have that back and forth. It's all verbal, a lot of it. Some of it is skilly, some of it's rolly. A lot of it is just back and forth between the players and each other, or the players and the GM. And then you roll for initiative. And now we've switched into a tactical war game. And I think that's cool. That's important. It allows me a good control of the pace of the game. It allows me a good control of the mood. It allows me to plot exciting cliffhangers, because I can look over at the clock and go, man, it is nearly midnight. We're going to nearly break up here soon. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. As you round the corner, roll some dice. You see 6 sets of eyes glowing back, reflecting back your torchlight. You hear a growl, and maybe a tentacle, and then when they come back, and that's where we'll end. And when they come back, they know it's going to happen, and right, and you can get that little excitement and a little tension for the next episode and next week and so on. So it allows me to shift gears, and I appreciate that. And then the final reason why I prefer, say, a rules heavy game to a rules light game is actually sort of very practical. I can ignore rules at will. That's what I always tell people. I say, look, I always laugh when people say cheat you have those 44 rules and you go, yeah, some of those guys were cheating. 100%, obviously. I always say, look, there's no reason to cheat. There's no reason to, first off, I'm rooting for you. Secondly, I can make this game as hard as I want. Like I can, if you're GMing, I can tune the difficulty however I want. On the fly, if I want to. Now, I tend to try not to. I tend to try to, set up a scenario and then walk away and stick with it because that's part of the joy. And we can discuss that later. That's a different discussion. But if there's a narrative reason, for instance, that the players, they're done, right? So or even a mood reason or a table reason. So let's say, okay, they've gone through the dungeon, they are beaten to crap. They have 4 days to get back. The navigator's unconscious. The healer is broken. And we could play that out. And that could take another hour of another rule set that we're sitting there going through. Or I can just hand wave it and go, you're going to make it back. It takes you 6 days and you make it back. And there could be any number of reasons to do that. One could be, it's late. I want to get them back to town so that we can sort of wrap up, get ideas for their downtime and that they're going to be in town, and get ready for the next story or whatever that's coming up. It could be they're tired of my shit. Like it could really be. They're just tired. It's like, look, we literally spent 3 hours in that hellhole you call a dungeon. And it was rough and it was awesome and we had a great time. And we just want a change of pace. So please don't make us roll all the way back. And now they don't say this to me, but you have to read the room as a GM sometimes. And you just go, you know what, I'm going to ignore it and just let them get back. And everybody breathes a sigh of relief. And then we're on to role-playing at the tavern or whatever. It's easier to ignore your own rules-heavy bits than to somehow arbitrarily add a subsystem in to be able to shift gears. We're playing a fate, and almost everything we do, you roll the fate dice, and you add and play, and it's based on all your traits and so on, and that's great. But I can't shift gears, so let me add a more detailed combat system. Well, that's actually harder to do on the fly than it is to just ignore what you already got, in my opinion. And so for that reason, I tend to lean fairly rules heavy in my games and go, yeah, if I need to ignore a rule, I'm just going to ignore the rule. And if someone comes back and says, hey, why'd you ignore that rule? I'm going to be like, well, because I didn't think you guys wanted to play out the 2 hours of the trip back with everyone injured, and I try not to ignore rules that benefit the players. That's actually not the point. We're not trying to make the game hard for the players when we ignore these rules. We're typically just trying to do what's correct for the table and the narrative at the time. And you might say, well, if you're just doing what's correct for the narrative, why have the rules in the first place? And the answer is for all the other reasons, frankly. Because we got here through the rules, right? We got here through the simulation, but we're not tied to it. We don't have to follow it all the time. We can do what's best for the table, and it's easier to back off than it is to somehow step on the accelerator and go, you know what we're going to do this week? We're going to add a detailed combat system to our Super Rules late game. Oh, okay, right. I mean, that's a harder. I mean, and you can do it, and I'm sure people have done it. But it's just way harder to do that, say, on the fly. Whereas I can make a arbitrary decision as a GM to go, you know what? I'm going to ignore exact fall damage this time for whatever reason, right? Or whatever. I'm not gonna, we're not gonna worry about fall damage or whatever. We're gonna say you make it to the top of the thing. We're gonna say you get home and move on because I feel that we all feel it's time to move on. And that's it. So we did come in. That's a long video for me just yapping at you. So I do appreciate if you did indeed make it this far, which I'm sure none of you have. Thank you very much. If you have comments, please fire them to me. I love to read them and I will comment back and we'll discuss it. If you have any other ideas or want to, do you want me to ramble about other GMing topics? I'm in. Let's do this. I do have a few topics in mind. We'll get to that later. Have a good afternoon, and I will talk to you later on. Bye bye.